For many voters, one issue in particular is at the center of the battle right now with the next Supreme Court nominee, abortion.
As a pro-life Christian, I'm very excited about this opportunity. We've waited a long time for this.
Pro-life, whoever the candidates, I don't care if it's Democrat or an independent or Republican, the life issue is the #1 issue for me.
NBC News correspondent Ellison Barber joining me now from Miami. Ellison, you spoke to pro-life voters there in Florida who say this Supreme Court decision is their moment. Would you tell us more about their hopes for this next nominee?
Yeah, I mean, for those voters here in Florida, and some of them identified as evangelical, others identified as Catholic, they feel like this is a moment they have been waiting for decades. They want to see President Trump move ahead with a nomination for someone who they consider to be a pro-life judge. Particularly, the favorite among people we have spoken to is Judge Amy Coney Barrett. And they also say they want to see the Senate vote on it, and they want them to vote on it as soon as possible. Here's more of what we hear.
It's huge because the only way to overturn Roe v. Wade is by the Supreme Court. My hope is that more than overturning Roe v. Wade is establishing the personhood of the unborn.
It is the president's prerogative, and also in the Constitution, he's supposed to nominate someone. I think it should continue with the process.
And for those voters there who are opponents of abortion rights and want to see Roe v. Wade overturned, they say that they feel like this is a very big, very important moment in their fight. But they don't think it is the moment, if you will, because, of course, many will tell you that if Roe v. Wade were to be overturned, then it sends it back to the states. So they don't necessarily see it as the end of their fight. But they do say that this is something they have been waiting for decades, and they feel like the position they're in right now and who they expect President Trump to nominate in the Senate to confirm in their mind and in what they're hoping for in Judge Amy Coney Barrett would be someone who would be a part of overturning Roe v. Wade and starting kind of really what they want to see ultimately happen, which is the end of legal abortions in the United States. Allison?
Ellison, Florida could potentially decide this election. It's a place Trump won back in 2016. What are the other big issues for the voters whom you spoke with, and who do they think will best address those issues?
Well, these voters who, by all means, by their own descriptions, by I think anyone's description, are really very ardent and devout, what they would call pro-life voters, abortion issues and things related to that is their top issue. And really, that is all they are paying attention to. When I pressed some of them on the idea of, you know, what is significant for them or what other people would say should be considered, quote unquote, life issues, if you will, tied to policies related to education, immigration, healthcare, the answer that I pretty consistently got back, and what one advocate told me very directly, was that they feel like everything else, all of the other laws, all of the other topics, that they assume life. So in their view, all of those are kind of secondary if abortions are still happening and abortions are legal in the United States. So it was hard with this particular group of abortion opponents who really see that as really their sole issue to get an answer on what they're looking for beyond that, because for them, they will make the argument that you can't have other policy discussions or other legislation as high of a priority if you don't first address this issue, which critics would say is hypocritical or even intellectually dishonest. But for these voters, it's not. That is their sole focus, and it's hard to get them to answer beyond that one issue. Allison?
Ellison, you touched on this earlier, but many of the voters you spoke with are Christian, and many of them have also called President Trump's behavior unchristian. Let's talk more about how that plays into their decision-making this November.
Yeah, you know, prepping for this assignment, I listened to a podcast related to this, and one of the participants, speakers who called himself a pro-life lawyer, had talked about at one point how he said President Trump, even if he lies on everything, if all he does is lie, 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 at the end of the day, he has been the most important, the best pro-life president we've ever had. So nothing else matters. And that struck me because, you know, I grew up going to church every Sunday in a Presbyterian family going to Christian church. And I know very well that if you read through the Bible, it says that lying is an abomination, not something that's okay. So I wanted to know, how do they reconcile kind of those two, what seem like very opposing positions in their support with President Trump? And if they're essentially arguing that the end justifies the means. And some of the people that we spoke to, their answer was essentially yes. Listen here.
He should keep his mouth shut. He said the dumbest things, the stupidest things. He's a narcissist. He's proud of himself. He's all full of himself. But he's the best pro-life, pro-economic president we've ever had.
And I know a lot of pro-life people that do not like Donald Trump, but they want to vote for him because of he has kept those promises of being pro-life.
So for this very ardent group of abortion opponents, this is why they voted. This moment is why they voted for President Trump. And while, again, they don't necessarily think one justice coming onto the court or changing the balance of the court could necessarily mean to what their ultimate goal is, which is making abortions illegal in the United States. They'll point to Justice Roberts and say, we thought he was going to be more, quote unquote, pro-life than he is. But they do feel like this is the closest they have ever been to it. And the reason why they voted for President Trump is because they believed that he would be the person to appoint judges who would overturn Roe v. Wade. And right now they see this as sort of the last step to seeing that happen. Allison.
Ellison, it's so interesting, that reasoning, particularly the answers to your last question. So fascinating to hear what people had to say there. Thank you so much for sharing their perspectives with us. Really appreciate it.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.